something unprecedented has unfolded along the world's longest undefended border. Canada and the United States, trading partners for generations, are now locked in an escalating lumber dispute that's sending shockwaves through North American housing markets. Tariffs exceeding 45%, mills closing across British Columbia and Alberta, lumber prices swinging wildly between $400 and $900 per thousand board feet. And in the middle of it all, a housing crisis in the United States that just got significantly worse. What started as another round of trade negotiations has transformed into something far more consequential. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, sworn into office in March 2025, responded to American tariffs with over $1 billion in support programs designed to redirect Canada's lumber industry away from U.S. dependency. The implications are staggering, and they're unfolding right now. I'm Nora Blake, and you're watching Nora Blake Reports. If you want to understand how trade policy decisions are reshaping housing affordability across North America, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what's happening in this lumber dispute will affect construction costs, home prices, and economic policy for years to come. Let's start with the numbers that brought us here. The United States has long accused Canada of unfairly subsidizing its softwood lumber industry. This dispute, often called the Lumber Wars, dates back to the early 1980s. But the current chapter, known as Lumber 5, began after a 2006 agreement expired in October 2015. Throughout 2025, lumber tariffs escalated dramatically. In early 2025, President Donald Trump announced plans for a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, though lumber was ultimately exempted from that broad tariff in April. However, existing lumber-specific duties remained in place and actually increased. In August 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce doubled countervailing duties on Canadian softwood lumber, from 6.74% to 14.63%. Combined with anti-dumping duties, total tariffs reached 35.2%, up from 14.4% earlier in the year. But that wasn't the end. In October 2025, President Trump invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, citing national security concerns to impose an additional 10% tariff on global softwood lumber imports, including from Canada. This brought combined duties on Canadian lumber to approximately 45%. According to the National Association of Homebuilders, more than 70% of softwood lumber and gypsum used by American homebuilders comes from Canada and Mexico, respectively. These tariffs don't just affect Canadian mills. They directly impact construction costs for every home built in the United States. The NAHB estimated that these tariffs would add approximately $6,000 to over $9,000 to the cost of a typical new home. That's not a small increase when the country is already facing a severe housing shortage. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March 2025 after succeeding Justin Trudeau, faced immediate pressure to respond. Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, brought significant economic expertise to the role. His response came in multiple phases. On August 5, 2025, Carney announced a $1.25 billion aid package specifically for Canada's softwood lumber sector. The package included three main components: $700 million in loan guarantees to help companies confront immediate pressures, delivered through the Business Development Bank of Canada; $500 million to support product and market diversification starting in fiscal year 2026 through 2027, and $50 million over 3 years to help reskill and support more than 6,000 affected forest workers. Critically, this announcement also included a new Buy Canadian policy for federal procurement. Under this policy, federal agencies and crown corporations must prioritize Canadian suppliers, including for lumber. Government construction projects, from infrastructure to federal buildings to military installations, would now be required to source Canadian lumber, even if American lumber was cheaper. A month later, in September 2025, Carney announced a broader $5 billion strategic response fund. This fund wasn't exclusively for lumber, but for all Canadian industries impacted by American tariffs. The fund offered flexible financing terms to help firms adapt, diversify, and grow. The practical implementation of Canada's support focused heavily on liquidity. Canadian lumber mills facing American tariffs suddenly had a significant problem. When your product faces a 45% import duty, your profit margins can disappear overnight. The Business Development Bank of Canada expanded its loan programs dramatically. Small and medium-sized enterprises could now access loans ranging from $2 to $5 million, with lower interest rates and longer maturities than standard commercial loans. For larger companies, the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan Facility offered even more flexibility. These weren't grants. They were loans that would need to be repaid, but they provided crucial breathing room for mills to continue operations while restructuring their business models. The logic was straightforward. Help mills survive the immediate shock, then support them in finding new markets and customers beyond the United States. Regional programs added another layer of support. The Regional Tariff Response Initiative, initially funded at $450 million, was increased to $1 billion over 3 years. Provincial governments in British Columbia, Ontario, and the Prairie provinces added their own support programs, including funding for forest access roads, manufacturing jobs initiatives, and sawmill chip support. Despite government support, the impact on Canada's lumber industry has been severe. Mill closures and curtailments accelerated throughout 2025, particularly in British Columbia, which accounts for a massive share of Canadian softwood production. In November 2025, West Fraser Timber Company announced it would permanently close its lumber mill in 100 Mile House, British Columbia, by year's end, affecting approximately 165 jobs. The company cited an inability to reliably access adequate, economically viable timber, combined with challenging softwood lumber demand and higher U.S. duties. West Fraser also announced it would indefinitely curtail its OSB mill in High Level, Alberta, affecting approximately 190 jobs. These closures would reduce West Fraser's capacity by hundreds of millions of board feet annually. In December 2025, Domtar announced the permanent closure of its pulp mill in Crofton on Vancouver Island, affecting approximately 350 employees. The company blamed continued poor pricing for pulp and lack of access to affordable fiber in British Columbia. Western Forest Products imposed temporary curtailments at its British Columbia sawmills during the fourth quarter of 2025, reducing lumber production by approximately 50 million board feet. Interfor Corporation announced a 26% curtailment in its manufacturing capacity. The list goes on. The mill closures weren't solely about tariffs. Canada's forestry industry faces multiple compounding challenges that make the tariff situation even more difficult to navigate. British Columbia has experienced decades of mountain pine beetle infestation that killed hundreds of thousands of trees. Wildfires in 2023 damaged approximately 1.4 million hectares of forest, creating long-term supply challenges. According to industry analysts, Canadian lumber production in British Columbia was down approximately 6.9% in 2025, compared to previous years. Gary Bull, a forestry expert, noted that planning delays in the forestry sector can span 2 years or more between deciding to harvest a tree and actually processing it at the mill. When fiber supply contracts and market conditions deteriorate simultaneously, mills find themselves in an impossible position. Kim Hockstad, president of the BC Council of Forest Industries, stated that while softwood lumber duties and trade uncertainty add significant pressure, not everything can be blamed on the trade dispute. Core issues within British Columbia's forest management also contribute to the sector's struggles. To understand why this lumber dispute matters so profoundly, we need to examine the American housing situation. The United States faces a severe housing shortage, though estimates of its exact size vary significantly depending on methodology. Zillow's analysis from July 2025 estimated the deficit at 4.7 million units, up from 4.5 million in 2024. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce also cited 4.7 million. Goldman Sachs Research estimated 3 to 4 million additional homes needed beyond normal construction. Freddie Mac's estimate was 3.7 million, while the National Association of Homebuilders put the figure at 1.5 million. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies cited 1.5 million as well. Regardless of the exact figure, there's consensus. America doesn't have enough housing. This shortage developed over more than a decade of underbuilding following the Great Recession. Housing construction fell sharply after 2008 and never fully recovered to meet population growth and household formation. In 2023, approximately 1.4 million new homes were added to America's housing stock. In 2024, about 1.63 million units were completed. These are records since 2007, but they're still not enough to close the deficit. The country would need to build roughly 2 million units annually for a decade just to address the existing shortage, while keeping pace with population growth. Lumber represents 15 to 25% of the cost of building and finishing a home in the United States. According to Home Innovation Research Labs, the average new single-family home uses approximately 15,000 board feet of framing lumber, plus more than 2,200 square feet of softwood plywood, and over 6,800 square feet of oriented strand board. When framing lumber prices increase significantly, those costs flow directly to home buyers. Throughout 2025, framing lumber prices displayed considerable volatility. According to various industry tracking services, prices ranged from lows around $420 to $460 per thousand board feet in mid-2025 to highs around $600 to $900 per thousand board feet at different points. As of January 2026, data from Gordian showed framing lumber at $872 per thousand board feet, while Trading Economics reported prices around $610. The National Association of Homebuilders tracks these prices weekly using the Random Lengths framing lumber composite price from high-volume production regions. The lumber market experienced significant oversupply in mid-2025 as importers rushed extra inventory into the country ahead of tariff implementations. This temporarily depressed prices despite the tariffs. But as that wall of wood gets drawn down and demand picks up during spring building seasons, prices are expected to rise again. Canada historically supplies approximately 25 to 30% of U.S. softwood lumber consumption, roughly 12 billion board feet annually. American domestic production runs around 58 billion board feet per year, while total U.S. consumption approaches 70 billion board feet. The mathematics are straightforward. Without Canadian imports, the United States cannot meet its lumber needs through domestic production alone. American lumber mills have added some capacity in recent years, but not enough to replace 12 billion board feet of Canadian imports. The U.S. Lumber Coalition, representing American lumber producers, has repeatedly claimed that domestic mills can meet demand. However, housing market analysts and home builder associations strongly dispute this. The National Association of Homebuilders has been particularly vocal in opposing lumber tariffs, arguing they harm housing affordability without solving the underlying supply-demand imbalance. Some American mills have actually curtailed production during 2025 despite the tariffs. Why? Because housing construction slowed due to high mortgage rates and elevated material costs. Mills were producing at a loss for much of the year. The tariffs created a complex situation where Canadian competition decreased, but American demand also fell. Looking ahead to 2026, lumber market forecasts remain highly uncertain. Multiple factors will influence prices: the pace of housing construction, mortgage rate trends, the extent of Canadian mill curtailments, potential changes to tariff policy, and broader economic conditions. Industry analysts project that housing starts could increase modestly in 2025 and 2026 as mortgage rates potentially decline. The National Association of Home Builders forecasted housing starts rising to approximately 1.38 million units in 2025 and 1.5 million in 2026. This would boost softwood lumber consumption. However, over 5 billion board feet of North American mill capacity has shut down since 2023 due to low prices, high costs, and in Canada's case, tariff pressures. With reduced capacity and potential demand recovery, analysts anticipate lumber prices could average $500 to $600 per thousand board feet through late 2025 and into 2026, with potential spikes during peak construction season. The Center for American Progress released analysis in December 2025, estimating that tariff-induced higher building costs could lead to 450,000 fewer homes being built over 5 years through 2030. At current home building rates, they calculated that an extra $27 billion in tariffs adds $17,500 in costs per new home. Canada's Buy Canadian policy represents a fundamental shift in government procurement. Every federal agency, Crown Corporation, and entity receiving federal funding must now prioritize Canadian suppliers for materials, including lumber. The scale of Canadian federal construction is substantial. Infrastructure projects, federal buildings, military installations, and housing initiatives. Prime Minister Carney's government also launched a program called Build Canada Homes, aimed at accelerating home building with specific requirements to use Canadian wood products. With an allocation of roughly $700 million in 2026, Build Canada Homes alone is expected to create $70 to $140 million of new demand for Canadian wood products. Railway companies have also been encouraged to cut freight rates for transporting Canadian steel and lumber interprovincially by 50% beginning in spring 2026. These measures create guaranteed domestic demand for Canadian mills at a time when American export markets face prohibitive tariff barriers. Mills that survive the current downturn will have access to stable government contracts and subsidized financing, allowing them to restructure operations with less reliance on American customers. However, it's important to note that Canada still heavily depends on American markets. In 2024, nearly 12 billion board feet, or about 59% of Canadian softwood lumber shipments, went to the United States. That's an enormous market that cannot be replaced quickly or easily. Prime Minister Carney's announcements emphasized market diversification. The goal is to reduce Canada's heavy dependence on American customers by finding new international buyers. However, the practical challenges of achieving this are substantial. Offshore markets for Canadian lumber remain limited. Asian markets, including Japan and South Korea, have different specifications and established suppliers. European markets similarly have their own supply chains, primarily sourcing from Scandinavia and Baltic states. Breaking into these markets requires significant investment, establishing new relationships, meeting different building codes, and accepting potentially lower margins. The Canadian government's $500 million diversification fund aims to help mills make these transitions. Programs include the Forest Innovation Program, investments in forest industry transformation, green construction through wood, the Indigenous Forestry Initiative, and the Global Forest Leadership Program. But realistically, even successful diversification will take years. You cannot simply redirect 12 billion board feet of annual lumber shipments from the United States to Asia or Europe overnight. The infrastructure, relationships, and market demand don't yet exist at that scale. American homebuilders find themselves caught in an impossible situation. They need Canadian lumber because domestic production is insufficient. But Canadian lumber now carries 45% tariffs, making it significantly more expensive. The National Association of Homebuilders has been lobbying intensively for tariff relief or building materials exemptions. In the weeks before President Trump's tariff announcements, NAHB sent letters to administration officials emphasizing that imposing tariffs on building materials would raise construction costs, discourage development, and force consumers to pay higher home prices. Carl Harris, NAHB chairman, stated that while President Trump issued an executive order on his first day in office directing agencies to deliver emergency price relief to lower housing costs, the move to raise tariffs by 25% on Canadian and Mexican goods would have the opposite effect. Some builders attempted to stockpile lumber ahead of tariff implementations. This created temporary oversupply and price depression in mid-2025. But that strategy has limits. Lumber doesn't store indefinitely, and tying up capital in inventory creates cash flow problems. Builders also face pressure from interest rates and overall economic uncertainty. Even when lumber is available, if mortgage rates remain high, home buyers cannot afford to purchase, which reduces builder demand for materials. The lumber dispute has become deeply intertwined with broader U.S.-Canada trade relations. President Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state and his aggressive tariff policies created a surge in Canadian nationalism that helped propel Mark Carney to power in March 2025. Carney positioned himself as the leader who could stand up to Trump while protecting Canadian economic interests. His Liberal Party had been trailing in polls for over a year, but Trump's rhetoric and tariff threats dramatically shifted public sentiment. Carney won the Liberal leadership election with over 85% of the vote, and subsequently won the April 2025 federal election. The United States and Canada are currently engaged in periodic bilateral talks on lumber duties. However, officials from both countries have struggled to reach agreements. The previous softwood lumber agreement from 2006 expired in 2015, and efforts during both the Obama and first Trump administrations failed to produce a new deal. As of December 2025, CUSMA qualifying goods from Canada are generally exempt from some Trump tariffs, but the Section 232 lumber tariffs remain in place. Legal challenges to some tariff implementations are ongoing, though outcomes remain uncertain and likely won't affect the lumber-specific duties. The North American lumber dispute of 2025 reveals how quickly trade policy can reshape industries, affect millions of lives, and expose systemic vulnerabilities in housing and construction. Canada's lumber industry is undergoing painful restructuring. Mill closures in communities like 100 Mile House and Crofton represent real families losing livelihoods, not just statistics. The federal support programs may help surviving mills adapt, but they cannot reverse job losses or prevent economic devastation in forestry-dependent communities. In the United States, the housing shortage continues to worsen. Tariffs on lumber and other building materials are raising construction costs at precisely the moment when America needs to dramatically increase home building. The mathematics don't work. You cannot solve a 4.7 million unit housing deficit while making it more expensive to build homes. What happens next depends on multiple factors. Whether tariffs are modified or removed through negotiations, how aggressively Canada pursues market diversification, whether American mill capacity can expand, and how housing demand evolves with changing mortgage rates and economic conditions. One thing is certain: lumber wars have consequences, and those consequences are being felt every day by workers in Canadian mill towns, American home builders unable to find affordable materials, and families across North America struggling to find housing they can afford. This is a story still unfolding. The decisions made in Ottawa and Washington over the coming months will shape North American housing markets for years to come. If you want to stay informed on developments in trade policy, housing markets, and economic news that affects your life, make sure you're subscribed to Nora Blake Reports. Hit that like button if you found this analysis valuable, and share this video with anyone trying to understand why housing costs keep rising. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how this lumber dispute should be resolved. The intersection of trade policy and housing affordability is complex, but it's too important to ignore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next report.